Hey everyone, welcome to the Bay Area Content Marketing Meetup. If you're not familiar with us, go to meetup.com and search for Bay Area Content Marketing. Really excited today. We're going to learn about rethinking innovation. I think that's a really important topic. I'm going to hand things over to Rich Schwerin, who's going to be our host today. So Rich, take it away.
Hey, thank you, Dennis, and thank you. I see some sponsors on the Zoom today. Appreciate everybody making this meetup possible. It's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, keynote speaker, best-selling author of multiple books, I kind of lost count, marketing and innovation strategist, Carla Johnson. And Carla's talk today is on how innovators come up with great ideas that deliver extraordinary outcomes. And Carla, I know you're going to talk a little bit about your new book, Rethink Innovation. Apparently, there's a framework that's repeatable, and you're going to help guide us on how we can be more innovative. In this case, in all the excellent content that we do. So, welcome, Carla, and take it away.
Thank you. And I'm going to share my screen if that's all right with everybody.
Sure thing.
Do I get permission? Let's see.
I think you have permission. Yep, there
Can
you
you
go.
see me now? Can you see my screen?
Ooh, yeah, this is fancy looking.
Ooh, kind of magic. That's the magic of Prezi Video. I always give them a shout out because I love Prezi Video. But thanks, Rich, and thanks, Dennis, for inviting me to join this group. I wanted to speak at this group for so long because I know you guys do such cool things, and I appreciate you. This is the book that Dennis and Rich are going to give away 5 copies of. So you might want to wait until after I'm done talking to see if you want to have anything to do with that. And but the reason I feel that this is so important, and especially right now, is one of the numbers that I came across when I was doing research for this book is that 90% of innovation happens outside of traditional market or traditional innovation and R&D groups with, product and service line development. And I think the whole idea of content marketing in general is one of the most innovative, not just marketing approaches, but business model approaches. And as we look at how we start to do whatever it is that we're going to do, from today forward, we really have to start to learn to rethink what innovation is and what it looks like. And that's why I wanted to share what I've learned and what I put in the book about what these prolific innovators, the people who are consistently able, for decades, not just a couple of months or a couple of years, but for decades, what they've learned and what they do and how they approach consistently coming up with great ideas. Because when we, like as content marketers and marketers, when we think about innovation, there's always these iconic brands that we look at, that we see that do these really cool things. Lego is probably the icon of a brand that does amazing content marketing with their, magazines and their videos and a Hollywood feature film. And then you look at a brand like Absolute, and this one I've had such fun watching because their whole brand campaign about we've got nothing to hide, where they have the CEO and other leaders literally naked and pixelated, of course, but they show the whole transparency of how they make what it is that they do. And they have employees in the same situation, buck naked. And, there's not a lot of companies that would be willing to do that. And you look on the B2B side, even like the B2B side of Volvo, where they got Claude Van Damme, the muscles from Brussels, to do the splits between these 2 semis as they drove in reverse. And then a brand like IBM, and they created the world's smartest computer to go on, primetime TV to compete against the world's smartest minds. But what happens is that when we start to look at brands like this, it makes us think that we probably can't measure up, because in a lot of the other industries that we work in, we're not going to be able to convince anybody. It may, maybe the drunk guy in accounting to do, a photo shoot where he's buck naked. You aren't going to get CEOs to do that. It's hard to get a budget approval to make a major Hollywood feature film or to create the world's smartest machine. But what we have to keep in mind is that it's not about doing everything that these brands do, but really looking at them for inspiration instead of saying, I could never be a Lego. I could never be, a Volvo kind of brand. And the reason this is so important is because this is what our audiences are looking for now in terms of inspiration or content or things like that, that delight and surprise us. Now, it was a couple of years before all of us worked from home and got so used to seeing each other on our computer screens. I was at a conference in in Las Vegas, and there was a gentleman from Zappos who was speaking about the Zappos approach to customer experience. And while I was sitting there, my big client at the time mined boron in Latin America. And I thought, what can a company that sells and gives away shoes have anything to do with what I talk about? And the funny thing is that I would look around the room and I would see all of these other people checked out and essentially thinking the same thing too. And I know in B2B, there's a lot of disconnect between, oh, it's a consumer brand, it doesn't relate to me. And I know that that was definitely something that was happening to me. And then a couple of days later, I was thinking about this like scenario that I had in this phenomenon. And I went and I did a search on these, characteristics like we do with the internet to see what it was. And it's actually a psychological phenomenon. It's called Brand Detachment Disorder. And you can do a search for it and read about it yourself. But it essentially means it's this tendency that we have to dismiss the relevancy and the application of great ideas because we think that what we sell is different and unique. And the interesting thing is that I realized it wasn't just when I heard somebody talk about Zappos. I mean, we've seen the launches into space this last month with Richard Branson, and I think everything that he does at Virgin doesn't apply to me. I think about Apple and how they launch products, and I'm still very B2B and very industrial driven. That doesn't apply to my clients. Or you think about Red Bull, the icon of marketing and content marketing. I always think, that doesn't really relate, but my clients aren't going to turn into a media company that happens to sell something else. But the thing is that brand detachment disorder and understanding that we have it starts with admitting that we have a problem. And this is something that I wanted to get some feedback on from you guys. Like, what brands do you hear about that when you hear about them, you think, oh, I'm so sick and tired of hearing about them because everybody says how great they are. What are some of those brands that you're hearing about?
Salesforce.
But especially in the Bay Area. Sorry, Amy.
Hey.
What are some of the others?
Amazon.
I was about to say Amazon too.
Yeah.
I love
Amazon.
being an Amazon Prime member.
Yeah.
I love the 2-day shipping. That's like the
I know,
Anybody
now
else?
I get irritated when 2-day shipping doesn't show up in 2 days. Yeah.
Well, I get same day delivery sometimes. It's just incredible. Anybody tired of hearing about Robinhood?
I've never heard that brand.
Yes. I agree.
What do they do? What do they do?
Yeah.
Oh, they target 20-something-year-old young males to do stock trading. They do a lot of people doing day trading. Yeah, big. They just went public a couple days ago.
Did you shed a tear when their IPO didn't go so well?
I did not. I did not.
But they bounced back, Rich.
Yeah, it's all hype
Yeah,
anyway.
huge gain this week.
I'm just wondering how Todd fell into the 20-year-old ecosystem on his cookies.
Fake ID, Amy. Fake ID.
I got two 20-something-year-old sons. And the one son sat on his couch one night and opened not a Robinhood, an Ameritrade account, went to his bank, transferred thousands of dollars from his bank account into his Ameritrade account and started making a couple trades, all while sitting on the couch. It was
Wow.
It's incredible. But that's the audience that Robinhood's been going after.
Okay, yeah, so you hear that. So, and once you start to hear a brand like this, it seems like they're everywhere. And I think, the companies like, Salesforce and Amazon, they're held up as brands that everybody always looks at and says they're amazing. And when we're in that kind of situation, when we hear these other brands held up like that, we think, well, I could never do that. There's always a reason why we can't be like that brand. But one of the first way that you start to realize that you have brand detachment disorder is to understand how to recognize it in the real world. And so if you're in these meetings and somebody brings up, Amazon, Salesforce, Robinhood, something like, a brand like that, and you start to roll your eyes or you think, I'm so tired of hearing it. Like, we'll never be able to live up to those expectations. We don't sell that kind of product. My boss or client would never go for it. We're just not that kind of company. That's not how we do things here. I think that's one that's heard a lot in pretty much every company. is understanding that when you hear those kind of conversations or even those own kind of thoughts come in your head, that's a sign that you've triggered this brand detachment disorder. Now, this matters because there's a way that you start to deal with this when you start to think about discounting this great, inspiring work and not understanding how to tap into it for your own work. And it's something called a brand transplant. And a brand transplant's when you take something that's really great, an experience, an idea, something that you've seen elsewhere, and you're able to transplant that actually into your own work. Because this right here, this ability to transplant the essence behind a great idea is the one undeniable characteristic of innovators and innovative brands that works all the time, every place and everywhere. So that's what I want to talk to you about a little bit is these companies that are perpetual innovators and the cultures that they have within them. So a traditional company, if you look at it and how they look at innovation, they see that there's a particular group that's responsible for innovation. It could be a specific innovation group. It could be R&D, it could be product development, but it's a specific group that has that title and that responsibility. And if you ask somebody else in the company, how to do something different, how to become more innovative, however you phrase that question, they say, well, that's not my responsibility. Like that's what that group over there does. Or they say, I'm not smart enough to know how to do that because I'm not a design thinker. I'm not a data analyst. I'm not an engineer. I never worked at McKinsey or Deloitte or whatever. And it really starts to hurt the ability for companies and teams in general to innovate at and come up with these great ideas and put them into play across the whole company, especially as we start to look at 90% of innovation happens outside of the traditional places that we expect it to happen. But innovative companies, they believe that anybody can, and they actually have the responsibility for coming up with great ideas. And they not only look for it, they expect it, and they create a culture, values, employee review systems, hiring systems that really draw out that ability to think innovatively from every employee that they have. Now, this is really important because as we talk about how do we become more innovative and how do we become better critical thinkers and how do we deliver this kind of work that really stands out from everybody else, it's the idea that you can't have open innovation if you're closing off the participation and who's allowed to be a part of coming up with these ideas. Because innovation, especially right now at the times that we're in, is everybody's business at every level of a company. So when we start to look at what does it look like then for perpetual innovators, when I learned that this was really an issue, it was a couple of years ago when I had a client that I was working with. And I was sitting right here at my desk in Denver and the telephone rang. It wasn't an email. It wasn't a text. It was, or a web bot. It was an old fashioned phone call. And it was this man, Mohammed Hayil Saeed. And he was calling me from Canada. And he told me this story about how he had been a student at McGill University in Montreal. And he said, as a student, he noticed a couple of things. He said, there on this one side, there was always this group of students that it didn't seem to matter what their class was, who their teacher was, how much they studied. They always struggled. But on the other hand, it was a group of students. It didn't seem to matter what the class was, who the teacher was, how much they studied. They always succeeded. And he said it didn't seem to have a consistent rhyme or reason for what was going on. And he was talking to one of his professors after class one day, and they asked themselves a question: what if it's not the education system that's a problem? What if it's the entire process of learning? And that was an inspiration that was behind them starting a company called Mentorina. And Mentorina was a learning management software platform that used all sorts of technology to understand how fast students read and learn and go through their schoolwork, and gives them hints as in, it seems like you're taking too long. How about if we go back and review some of these things, or you're going through it too fast, maybe you're not catching all the details. And when I started to work with Mohammed, one of the things that he wanted to talk about is it's not about the technology, it's about the story that you tell. So I felt so proud of him as a non-marketer to really understand that aspect. But that's how we came up with the story for the brand that education is really more about brighter futures and creating opportunities for people. It's not just about the process of sitting in a classroom and learning things. And it was that resonated so well with their audience that we moved forward and started to work on a content marketing strategy for them. And when I asked Mohammed, like, what's a brand that really inspires you? He said, oh, hands down, it's Disney, because it doesn't matter where you enter into the brand, you always have the same experience. It could be, a theme park, a store at the mall, a movie, whatever it is. They're very consistent with what they deliver. And he said, I want that, because they had a large product portfolio that they were going to be able to offer, in addition to helping their education clients with some consulting and planning and things like that. So he said, that's the kind of experience that I want to create through content. And so we put together a content marketing strategy, and he took it to his executive team and he laid it all out. And then when he was done, and if you've ever been in a meeting with a finance person, or especially the CFO, it was the CFO who was the first person who pushed himself back from the table and crossed his arms. And he said, we're not doing any of this, because first, we're an education company. We sell to really smart people who have PhDs. Our developers have PhDs. We don't have theme parks. We don't have dogs. We don't have princesses. Like, nothing that you're talking about relates to this company. But what I want you to do is go back, and I want you to put ads in industry magazines. I want you to do direct mail pieces. I want you to sit and cold call school systems. And so instead of every day going into work and being happy and excited and feeling like he was purposeful and his ideas were valued and rewarded, he every day he went to work and said, you know what, I guess I just have to do the same thing that marketers have always had to do. And instead of asking what would Disney do, as he started to look at all of these ideas that he had to deal with a lot of the pushback constantly from this executive team. And man, I hate to say this, because I felt like I should have known better in helping him. But what I realized is that it's three really important things that stop others who are afraid of big ideas and new ideas from engaging in them. And the first, and I think this is true of at some level in every company, is that fear is the biggest hurdle. And if we can develop a process to take new ideas and help them feel more safe and less threatening and fear-filled, that's the first big thing. The second thing I learned is that if we're going to make these big leaps, they have to be done with small incremental steps, and really make creativity and innovative thinking a habit, rather than something you do in like big amounts, but only once in a while, and it scares the dickens out of everybody. And then the third thing is that we really need to put a process together, just like we do for everything else that we do as marketers, to come up with the ideas that's just as strong as the ideas that we have on the end, at the end, in total. Because this is what these perpetual innovators, these very consistent performers, have learned how to do, and what they're able to do over time. So as we look at what do great brands do, I want to walk you through an example with somebody, and I know quite a few of you know our friend Tim Washer. But if we looked at the idea of, what happens if comedians create content? So Tim Washer, he used to be the creative director at Cisco, and his background is in stand-up comedy, and he's worked with the best of the best. He was a writer for Amy Poehler, Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live. He worked with Conan O'Brien. He still jokes that if Conan O'Brien needs a crooked politician or a drunk lawyer, he gets the call. He's worked with Bill Nye the Science Guy, Stephen Colbert. So the guy knows funny. And when Tim was in comedy, it was kind of a, up and down profession as far as income. And he did go in-house, and he worked at IBM, and at a point he worked at Cisco. So instead of writing funny lines for Amy Poehler for Saturday Night Live, he went to work every day and thought about how to market things that look like this: telecom routers and switches and all sorts of things that are metal wires in a metal box. And then it was 1 year, and they were getting ready to do a product launch, and the product launch happened to be coming out the early part of February. And he said to the team, he said, how about instead of the usual, talking head executive or engineer talking about the product, how about if we do something different this year? And he had happened to be in a New York comedy club, I think it was a few weekends before, and Ray Romano was on stage. And Ray Romano is just a classic, amazing stand-up comedian. And what Tim noticed is that as Ray came out and he started to give his routine, there were all sorts of things that he would do. It was about how he talked about things that really mattered to the audience, but sometimes weren't funny in the real life. But he made it so big and so ridiculous that people started to laugh. And he would watch as Ray got people to laugh, and people emotionally put their walls down, and he could see their physical body relax. And he noticed just a complete change in energy in the interaction, and especially this feeling of intimacy in this group of people that didn't know each other, and this comedian on stage. And this is the first step that I want you to know about the process of coming up with these ideas. Is Tim is very, very good at observing, and that's what the most prolific innovators really understand. And when we stop and we take time to observe the world around us and what's going on, it really heightens our awareness, and it makes us more sensitive to things that we would normally ignore in our everyday life. And I know for me now, just starting to get out and about in the world outside of my own four walls in my home, even going to a coffee shop, there's like so much sensation and things that I noticed that I never did before. And I think it's a really powerful tool when we're able to put down our phone, take a deep breath, and step away from work and really look at what's going on around us. So that's the first step, is observing. Now, the second thing that Tim did is that he took all of these things that he observed from Ray's comedy routine, and he started to distill them. And he said, I realized that by talking about the mother-in-law and the in-laws and the kids and all of these things, he was putting together collections of things that mattered, but they started to have a broader theme. So it wasn't just about your mother-in-law, but it's about, sometimes the people that are closest to you can be the people that irritate you the most. But he started to see how all of these things were related in ways that he didn't realize had a relationship before. And that's when his mind went into distilling what he saw. And this second step of distilling is when you're able to look across all of these different things that you've observed and start to see patterns in them. And this ability to recognize patterns in what we see is something that comes very natural to our brains once we've relaxed and let it start to observe the world around us. Now, the third thing that Tim did is that he sat back and he said, okay, if what I've observed here with all of these things that Ray Romano did in this one situation, and I look at the patterns that come out of it, things about being able to build intimate relationships with people in a short amount of time, the power of humor and its role in those relationships, and how we can start to connect with people that are essentially strangers in a matter of minutes. That's when he looked at what he observed, the patterns he distilled. And this is actually that brand transplant process, part of the process, about being able to take the essence behind an experience and transplant that into the work that you do, relate it that way. And when you relate, and he was thinking about how can I use comedy and humor in this way in sales situations at Cisco, particularly during a product launch. So what Tim was able to do by relating is that he could find these hidden connections and start to bring them out and emphasize them in new ways that they didn't do before. And this is the classic line about connecting the dots. This is how you actually literally connect the dots as you go forward, rather than turning around and looking at what had already happened and say, oh, now I see how they connect the dots. This is how you're able to actively connect them to make the process of coming up with the ideas next more inspired. And for Tim, what ended up out of this, out of his process, was that he understood that this wasn't about selling, but it was really about sharing an experience and bringing out the humanness, the human side of Cisco. And he said, when you start to cut through the noise and you make somebody laugh, it really does build that connection in such a quick way that people don't give credit for. And I love that Tim brings it out in that way. And so what he was able to do is actually follow a process that all highly innovative people, what I call perpetual innovators, people who can do this consistently over a long period of time, they all do it whether they realize it or not. And what they do is that they start out by being more observant of the world around them, like Tim was in the comedy club that night with Ray Romano. And then they're able to distill what it is that they see into patterns that make sense. And then they take those patterns and do that brand transplant and relate it into the work that they're doing. And it's then and it's only then that they start to generate the ideas. Now for Tim, his idea was to do a comedy sketch that was centered on the idea of Valentine's Day. And the video, it's a 60-second video, and it starts out with a man saying, how many ways are there to say I love you? There's 3. And he goes through, you can buy you can buy your Valentine candy, you can carve your hearts into a tree, you can buy him expensive diamond rings. But now there's a 4th, and it's with the Cisco ASR 9000 router, which sounds ridiculous, but that's exactly what he was able to do, was to take that ridiculousness and make it funny in a way that had incredible meaning. Now, it's these first 3 steps that make all the difference in the inspiration and the acceptance of new ideas, because it creates a storyline. Now, what happens now if we need a new idea is that we get on a Zoom call or we get in a conference room and we say, we need new ideas. Let's start brainstorming ideas, and no idea is a bad idea. So throw everything out there. And you know what happens? There's a ton of ideas that are horrible ideas. So you just pick that, the one that's good enough, and you start to run with that. And then when you go to pitch it to either your boss or your team or a client, it activates this brand detachment disorder, because they say, we're not that kind of company. We're not that kind of brand. We don't have that kind of budget. Our boss would never do that, would never go for that. That's not how we do things around here. And just like Mohammed, you end up going back and doing the same thing that you've always done. But this is a process that when you end up following it, you actually end up with extraordinary outcomes that you couldn't have expected in the first place. And for Tim, his extraordinary outcomes were, they didn't put money and PR behind launching this video. They put it out on YouTube. They let the sales team know, and it blew up from there. And blew up, 250,000 views for a B2B product launch video is pretty huge. But most importantly is that the sales team said when they would go into a meeting, either with an existing customer or with a prospect, and they showed this video, everybody laughed. And the salespeople would say, even with existing customers, all of a sudden there was this emotional connection that wasn't there before. And the customers would start to tell them things about their situations that the salespeople could never draw out of them before. For prospects, they were able to get in the door of 3 companies that they had been trying to get into for years, but they could never make any headway. The media picked it up and they said, who would ever imagine a Cisco router could be the perfect Valentine's Day gift? And they talk about the humanness of the video and what it meant to people who watched it. Analysts picked it up and said, you really need to look at Cisco, because they're very human, they're different, they're standing out from other people. And for B2B buyers, it was gold, because the first 2 places that they go to do due diligence before they buy a product is to the media and to analysts. And so these were outcomes that had Tim said, this is my checkbox for what I need to make sure happens, it wouldn't have come out with the same inspired and delightful kind of outcome, or even innovative, creative product like he did with this video. Now, when we look at why this happens, when you actually follow the process and tell the story of your idea from the point of what is it that you observed, what's the pattern that you were able to distill, how does this relate into the work that you do and the idea that you're generating, it shows a path of an idea and gives people context for why doing something completely different from what you've ever done before actually is a lot less risky and makes a lot more sense. The second reason that this process works is that you're able to get more people to say yes to more ideas more often. And it doesn't mean that every idea has to be huge and gigantic and disruptive, but the more you can get that path of yes going, it builds momentum. And that gets, I know when I hear yes a lot, I get excited and I keep asking for more and more and more and more. And the third reason that this works for the Perpetual Innovators is because it's how consistently you're able to create this standout kind of content and create on a broader, compete on a broader scale, not just within your industry, and also feel really great about the work that you deliver every day, whether it's you as an individual contributor or your whole team in general. Now, this is really what the most innovative thinkers in the world all do. They follow this same simple 5-step process, whether they realize it or not. This is the same process that Tim Washer used, and he is able to get people to say yes to the most ridiculous ideas that help them stand out in ways that their competition could never, ever be able to compete with. But what we have to do is that we have to start to rethink how we define innovation and what it actually looks like, and then put some simple, systematic processes behind it. And that's the whole idea behind the book that I wrote, Rethink Innovation, and why it matters so much to marketers, and especially right now. So Rich and Dennis, I'll hand it back to you guys if you have any questions.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Carla. I really appreciate it. I'll confess, on Zoom chat, I felt like I was passing notes in class, but I gave some context. I found your blog on B.D.D, found Tim Washer's video. Amy sent a hilarious Salesforce video. I confess I was watching, but I was multitasking. I do have a few
to do that, Rich.
Right. I do have a few questions. I also want to encourage folks to either chat your question, or I think if you use the raise hand emoji on Zoom, you move to the upper left of the gallery here. So first off, Carla, thank you. I'll start off with kind of a meta question, in that if you ask 10 people, you'll get 20 answers. How do you define innovation? And in your research for the book, Rethink Innovation, did you find any innovative answers to that innovation definition question?
I'll start with the last part of the question first. And I think if you ask 10 people to define innovation, you'd get at least 20 different answers. And that's one of the hardest things about innovation, is how do you do something that you can't define? Yeah. Or much less, how do you do something that doesn't have a common definition?
Right.
And that is one of the things that I looked at. And I define innovation as the ability to consistently come up with new, great, and reliable ideas. And each of those words has meaning, even though it sounds so simple. So a new idea doesn't have to mean something that's never, ever been done before. Like I look at things, the drive-through layout for McDonald's, a McDonald's restaurant, is patterned after a Formula One pit stop. So is it new to the fast food industry? Absolutely. Is it new, never been done in the world? No, absolutely not. So it's not that it's never ever been done before, but it's perhaps new to your industry or new in some way. And the second criteria, but honestly, we all know just because something's new doesn't mean it's innovative. The second characteristic is great. And I'll be honest, great's a lot more subjective. But I think of it in terms of David Ogilvy, where he talked about a great idea is one that makes you jealous that you didn't come up with it yourself, and kind of gives you that, hair standing up on your arm or the back of your neck. But even a new and a great idea isn't enough to truly be innovative. And it's the third leg of the stool, that it's reliable, that really matters. And a reliable idea is one that makes you money. And then when you put this all together, it's the ability to consistently, like, it's not just a one and done. Oh, I did it once when we needed it in that crisis, and now I'm an innovator. It's the ability to consistently deliver ideas that are new, great, and reliable, that I believe makes somebody innovative. And one of the things that really gets under my skin is when people say, oh, coming up with the ideas is the easy part. It's execution that's hard. And I always say the execution is hard because it wasn't a great idea to start with.
Mm-hmm.
If you have crappy ideas, it's always going to be hard, but you have great, well thought out ideas. And I didn't talk about it in this, but this whole process starts with an objective that you identify and go through and focus your ideas.
Well, and Amy reiterates on chat, it's the trouble is when people think innovation is a big idea, not really the case. Is it good? Is it great? Is it reliable? When you gave those examples, it's a dated reference, but I remember Oreo, you can still dunk in the dark. Quick thinking, given the Super Bowl power outage. God, I wish I had done that, right? And to your point, it's a novel approach that could be an idea, a way of thinking, an experience, a product, content, what have you. So thanks for that. I do have other questions, but I'm going to ask one from Elizabeth here on the chat. Carla, how do you differentiate between innovation versus disruption? And disruption is a word I'm so tired of hearing. Those of you playing bingo at home, bingo.
That's your buzzword bingo word. And like for me, disruption gives innovation a bad rap because people look at innovation and the whole idea of a company, particularly at scale, is to avoid disruption in their own company, because the more you have disruption, the less you have efficiency and a common focus and things like that. So even if we look at disruption, because I had a session with 150 CMOs last Friday, and one of them said, we just acquired a company and now we're in these meetings with the innovation team and they're all saying, we need the next big, ginormous $30 million disruptive idea like right now. Well, this disruption may disrupt an industry and change so I think of it as changing in a really short amount of time, the perception of an expectation of what happens in that industry. Mm-hmm. So if we look at something like, Uber, Lyft, or rideshare apps, it felt really, really disruptive. But actually what was happening there is that they took existing technologies and they just put them together along with a gap in what brands were delivering and what customers were wanting. And that's why it felt so disruptive. Mm-hmm. And then there was another part of your question, did I miss that?
Oh, disruption. It was the difference between innovation and disruption, and then disruption being one of the buzzword bingos. I think.
I think that idea of disruption is that it has to be huge and something that everybody notices and completely upsets the fruit basket in an industry. And I don't believe innovation has to be like that.
Right. I did hear something in your answer that I want to ask a follow-up on. You mentioned the innovation teams when you're presenting all these CMOs. In your research for the book, is it typical in corporations that there's a designated innovation team and that's their name of their team?
No, it's not. I wouldn't say that having a true innovation team is commonplace in a lot of companies, even in B2B, but I think there is a group within a company that is expected to be the innovation type people. And that's where I go to product and service, service line development, R&D, things like that. So they may not have that traditional innovation title, but it's pretty clear culturally that these are the idea people. And there's innovation, which is like, well, yeah, we need innovation. And then if you talk creative thinking, it's like, oh, that's what the marketers do. And something just happens. I don't understand it. And it's this impression that creativity is a nice to have, but innovation is a have to have. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that there's only certain people who are allowed or know how to do it.
Yeah, and to your point earlier in the presentation, innovation's everyone's job in a sense, right? You wouldn't just designate just one team. They're the idea people.
Yeah. I mean, especially if we go back to 90% of innovation happens outside of a product or service. If you aren't teaching everybody in the company how to think in this way, you're losing the opportunity to take advantage of so many things that are out there right now, and even solve problems. Yeah. Even solve problems.
I do want to note we're 45 minutes in. Do you have time for a few more questions?
Yeah, I do have a few more minutes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So about that innovation team, I want to talk a little bit about bottlenecks in your research for the book. How can leaders identify those innovation bottlenecks? Are there some typical bottlenecks you find just because humans? And then how do you uncork those bottlenecks, those blockers?
The biggest bottleneck for all of this is priority and focus. Mm-hmm. And that's why this is a process that I find innovative thinkers go through naturally, and they find a place for those ideas. Mm-hmm. But when I take people through this in workshops and teach teams and individuals how to do this, we start out with a very clear objective statement about what's a problem that we're trying to solve, what kind of outcome, what constraints do we have, and so that all of these ideas are directed towards something that immediately has a place in the company. And one of the things that happens in companies when they aren't when they aren't more thoughtful about opening up the doors and getting more people to be the innovators, is that it feels like they opened up a can of worms and they're herding cats. Because people going, I got an idea, I got an idea, I got an idea. But a lot of the ideas are really bad ideas because they're not new, great, reliable, and haven't gone through criteria.
Yeah.
And so it does create a bottleneck because you're not focusing what the specific issue that the idea either takes advantage of or solves a problem. And then the second one is that there's no way to prioritize. And then I would say, and I want to point to Tom for this, because we talked about this a little bit last week, is also looking at, it's not only about coming up with the new ideas. As we go through and prioritize, it's also saying, you know what, we thought this mattered, but just because it's on the roadmap now doesn't mean it should be. Like, what can we start to take off the table? Tom, you're nodding your head a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And yeah, I did have a question around any other good examples, like in B2B, like business model innovation or things beyond marketing that you think are interesting?
For innovation?
Yeah.
I look at business model and simplification a lot as huge opportunities for innovation, because I think back to, just like there's the ideas that stack up and don't have priority, and we think, oh, we're never going to get all this done. I think there's a lot of processes that companies put into place with how they do things that just stack process on top of process on top of process. And it kills all the free flow and simplicity, not just internally, but it makes it really hard for a customer to do business with a company. And one of my favorite examples is Emerson. They're an industrial manufacturer in St. Louis, Missouri. And this is something that across the company, they have been adamant about for more than a decade. And their CMO says her other title is Chief Complexity Reduction Officer, is always looking at how do we simplify, how do we simplify, how do we simplify? And getting things to be more simple on the outside for customers takes a lot of thought and innovation internally at how they look at the work that they do, how everybody integrates and works across business units and teams, and how they actually deliver that more simplified process on the outside. Like, for an example, she would say her customers would get 6 different invoices from Emerson, and they would say, why can't I just get one invoice? Like, is that so hard? And she'd look and she'd say, well, actually it is, but let's go figure it out, because it was a better experience for the customer. And that was highly innovative.
yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
I have another canned question, but I'll pause. Anyone want to come off mute and ask Carla a question?
I'll throw something out there. What you're talking about sounds a lot like continuous improvement processes that many companies strive for forever. Ever since kind of Toyota came up with that philosophy back in the 50s, I guess. How would you tie your innovation to continuous improvement?
And I think with continuous improvement, the focus is on continuous improvement, just like Six Sigma and the incremental, always doing better, better, better. That's just one place to apply this process. And it actually, when I started in on research for the book, what sparked it is that I had so many marketers come up to me and say, I could never come up with creative ideas like Red Bull or Apple or all of these other kind of brands just for either content marketing programs or marketing programs in general. And that's what made me start to look into, well, of the great marketers, how do they come up with those ideas? And then I saw it was really a bigger conversation than just marketing. So while, like I said, that's one place to apply it, it's not the only place.
Good. Anyone else? I saw some folks have had to bounce. We're at about 10 minutes till 1. I'll ask one last one, and then maybe Dennis, you can wrap. So it's a somewhat competitive job marketplace right now, right? And I think the pandemic has upended a lot of folks in terms of, wow, what am I doing? There's a lot of existential career opportunity going on. How to, as companies, battle for top talent, what are some of the ways we can better hire for innovation? Any guidance there?
Absolutely. And I'm going to put this in chat. I have an innovation archetype assessment.
Okay.
And Tom, did you take this?
I haven't yet, but I want to.
So here's a link. And what I found is that different people come up with ideas in different ways, but we tend to recognize only a couple of ways. There's like the Bill Gates, super left-brained, methodical, strategic kind of thing. There's the Steve Jobs, big picture, pushing everything, very provocative. But when I looked at it, it really took more than just those two kind of people. One, to come up with a great idea, and two, to see it across the finish line, whatever it might be. And so you'll see if you go to that page, there's 6 different archetypes. There's a provocateur who is always pushing the status quo. There's a strategist, and that's who we think of as a traditional, strategy planning kind of person. There's the psychologist who's really looking at things from an empathy point of view, what it's like to be the kind of like the customer of an idea. There's the culture shaper. And I think especially us as marketers, we've seen more of that be recognized with the rise of the storyteller. And if you have a great idea, but you can't tell a story about it and get people to buy in and get traction, it doesn't matter how great the idea is. Collaborator who's looking at, okay, we as one team or one small group, we're probably not going to be able to do this all ourselves. Depending on how big or broad the idea is, but a lot of times you need to collaborate across other departments and with other people. And then the last one is the orchestrator, and they're the ones who are willing to fearlessly lead and see this idea make it across the finish line and have those hard conversations early in the process so things don't get tripped up or canceled or shelved or whatever down the road. And they're really, really good at maneuvering all of that political stepping stones. So
good. Thanks. Yeah, I'm looking at the page now. I see our friend and your co-author, Robert Rose. I'm trying to wonder, how did he score on this, right?
I imagine he was probably a strategist.
Right. Yeah. Dennis reminds me here with 7 minutes left, there's a book giveaway. So maybe we'll pause on questions. Dennis, you want to take it away with the giveaway?
Sure thing. Hold on, I'm going to stop the recording. So before I do that, Rich. Oh, no worries, Rich and Carla, thanks so much for today's talk. I'm just going to wrap up the recording.